Islam has policies in place which would end this dictatorship and make sure that this dictatorship never rises again. And those policies are social and political. Those policies are independent of any other secular system which can influence, so these agent rulers would not be in place, because that's exactly what they are. In 2010, October 2010, Ben Ali, who later, France and Britain had a conference under the name of Friends for Libya, Ben Ali was praised by the World Bank for his policies. And look at the irony. How was the revolution started? Because of those economic crises. That economic crisis that a man decided to set himself on fire and burn alive because the system just wasn't looking after him or his rights. And here's the World Bank praising him. Hosni Mubarak would get millions and billions of dollars, into his account for what? For suppressing his people, for giving all of his loyalty to the outsiders. Saudi. Do we need to look any further than Saudi? What is the most resourceful region in the world that we can think of in the Muslim world? It's Saudi. Do Saudis have the right to their own oil? Does that oil benefit the Muslim countries? No. So that's my point, that now is the time to make real change. And we have to make real change. And I think one of the most interesting things is that when these people came out, the Arabic word for reform is islah. When these people came out, what do they scream? And I'm sure everybody knows, they didn't say الشعب يريد إصلاح النظام. No, they said الشعب يريد إسقاط النظام. That they want to topple the system, that they want to get rid of this entire system and start from anew. Now, like you said, whether that be Islam, and this is obviously now our job, that we make it clear that Islam has the capability and the possibility of bringing about this change. But the fact that the change has to be now full on, it can't be cosmetic.
Would you like to add anything to that?
Okay, I might be saying an awful thing here, but I just don't know how, just because it would be an Islamically, ideologically orientated state that would guarantee that cynical, opportunistic men, I hate to say it, would not rise to the top of this regime and still potentially be responsible for the things that Bashar al-Assad and countless other people, regardless of what religion they espouse. I'm just not sure that guarantees it, but...
Okay, now we're moving on to our question and answer session. So if anyone's got any comments or questions directed at any of the speakers, can you raise your hand now and we'll pass the mic over to you. Yeah, I saw you first. Do you want to come to the front and ask the question? Would you just like to stand up?
This is a question directed more at Farah. Okay, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but from your argument I gathered that you sort of criticise the Western models imposed on the East and instead favour an Islamic state or an Islamic-orientated alternative, basically. And I'm just going to use the example of Iran. And so despite America's efforts...
Could you speak up? We can't hear you.
Oh, sorry. Despite America's efforts during the revolution in Iran, they established an Islamic Republic in 1979. And in my opinion, Iran is a grossly violated society by internal as well as external actors, and as an Islamic-oriented society, in my opinion, extols very little of the virtues of Islam, so I just wanted to hear your thoughts on that. Because in my opinion that's like sort of the case in point of an Islamic-oriented or directed society, and I think, you know,
I actually completely agree with you, and I would add some other country names to that list. that would be Saudi Arabia, that would be Yemen, that would be Pakistan. So all of these these countries are oppressing women and men, but in particularly women. And this is the point exactly, that when you don't have Islam, like Lord Cromer said, a reformed Islam is Islam no more. So these people, what they have upon them is not Islam. And I think Muslims themselves see that. So like I said, women who are not allowed to drive in Saudi, that's got nothing to do with Islam. Women in the time of the Prophet used to ride camels and horses. And by that deduction now, we agree that women can drive. There's nothing wrong in them driving. Just unless they're going to commit some sin by driving, but I would argue that men are more likely to do the same. So the fact that nothing Iran has to offer, I would argue, is Islamic. The only thing that it maintains is a little bit of Islam that it holds on to and then threatens the West by. So I would completely disagree. The Islamic model that I'm proposing, and that millions of Muslims in the Muslim world are proposing, is a very system that the Prophet established, and that's that you have one leader, which is the Khalif, and then you have different governances. And the reason why Islam would not be oppressive, and I'm glad I've got the chance to answer this question now as well, is because obviously in this talk I couldn't go completely into the comprehensiveness of the Islamic system, but the basis of the Islamic system is Tawheed, which is the oneness of God. And this is a basis upon this society is ran. So from this belief now come human rights. From it come justice, social justice, economic justice. So this system would be implemented, and there would be no room for man-made laws to come in and interpret certain things. And it is those, in Iran, why are women oppressed? Why do women have to resort to prostitution to feed themselves? Because it is a male interpretation of Islam. It's not Islam. Islam is very clear, and this is why there is no need for interpretation. Islam is universal in the sense that it's completely compatible with modernization, yet at the same time it's fixed. So women's roles and responsibilities are now set. Women's rights are now set. Women can vote. Women have an absolute right to education because they are society. They are going to now educate the next society. So I think that would be my answer to it. The fact that the Islamic model, this is precisely one of the propaganda campaigns that when even Muslims have fallen into this. I have spoken to so many Muslims. In fact, I had an interesting exchange with a worker who worked in the hotel when I was in Tunisia. She wasn't wearing the hijab. By any Western standards, she would be considered secular. But, I asked her what she thought of this conference, and she said, we didn't know Islam like this. We didn't know Islam gave women the liberty of, traveling all the way this far to have a conference, to propose this solution. So that's the idea that now we have to learn to recognize the Islam that existed prior to this 1916 Sykes-Picot Agreement.
Any more questions? Yeah. Do you want to come to the front?
Basically, I recently read, I think Farah Khalid touched upon it, that in Morocco, if a girl is raped, the man if she marries the rapist, he's not longer criminalized. And it reminds me of another news story where in Pakistan, if women are raped again and they go to a cause, their Islamic cause, they can be imprisoned for zina charges, which is adultery charges. And when you read stories like that, it really makes you feel almost a reactionary feeling of hatred towards Islam, Sharia, and you seem to think, actually, I think our countries are they're better off not having Sharia implemented, and so you can easily say, actually, I want universal values like freedom, like democracy, human rights, which are going to safeguard our rights. So how would Farah Khalid answer that question, which is, sometimes we do see pictures of people chanting Islam, we want Islam, but a lot of the time we see images of people saying we want democracy, we want, universal rights, we want human rights, we want freedom. How would you answer that for people who are thinking, well, it's all good saying we need an Islamic state, but
don't know if Zoe will agree, but there is a different interpretation to democracy in the Arab world, that it's not so simple as, oh, man-made law over us, that, you know, religion has nothing to say. And this is why I made the point that inherently Islam exists within Muslim societies, and they have a similar interpretation of democracy. Their interpretation of democracy is a reflection of the oppression they're undergoing. And so what do they want? They want to be freed from these shackles of oppression. So democracy to them is the right to pray, is the right to wear the hijab, is the right to political freedom. And freedom to them, which, you know, we would argue for absolute freedom, that every human has the right to do whatever he wants. Freedom to them, again, is to live their lives peacefully, hassle-free, torture-free, and that's their freedom. But this is the thing, when we look at this again, it's to do with colonization, because as the West looks at the Muslim or Arab world, it defines their definitions for them. So the Arabs don't think of, you know, like, we've got the classic example of when the Tunisian women came out straight after Ben Ali's fall, and they were wearing hijab, because for so many years, they were not allowed to wear the hijab. So that's the kind of freedom that they are asking for. As for, you know, the pictures that you see of people beheading each other, and, you know, do you really believe that's Sharia? Do you really believe that's Islam? Islam is a religion which creates harmony between a society by putting these policies in place, right? So now, without any context, I'm sure some of the pictures are real, right? Without any context, we see these pictures and we think Sharia, evil, backward, we don't want it, kind of thing. But we have to examine Islam critically, and we have to examine it as an ideology, and we will find that, you know, this is a misinterpretation of Islam. It's not only a misinterpretation, but it's a half implementation as well. So everything else comes from secularism, but the social laws now come from Islam. How can that work? If half democracy, half Islam can't work, then half Islam, half democracy can't work either.
Okay, I guess to point out that I guess it has done in the past, but that democracy doesn't necessarily equal like the rampant secularism that we see in France. Democracy does not mean outlawing the hijab, but under the pressure of American or British or French governments, that can be incorporated into it. But I don't see democracy as synonymous with secularism that prevents people's rights to pray, people's rights to wear the hijab, people's rights to practice their religion publicly and freely. So.
Do you agree that it's open to interpretation though? So democracy here might not be as racist as it is in France, and that democracy in Bashar's Syria is now going to be a bit more communist-like. Do you agree that that is the nature of democracy, that it can be interpreted all over the world?
Yeah, democracy is entirely different. Sorry. Yeah, I think, I don't know, just because of the way countries develop and when corruption comes into it, I think democracy is different everywhere. I wouldn't argue that we have, well, that our democracy in the UK is not perfect, but then I guess that implies there is one type of democracy. But I'm not would it be possible to have a way of democracy within an Islamic state? The head of the Islamic State you were talking about, how would they be chosen? Like, how would they be chosen? How would it be negotiated in a new country that has tried to scrap its government? Like, how would this come about?
Well, this is the thing, that democracy isn't set, and that's precisely the point, that when a system isn't set, it's open to interpretation, right? So now in the Arab world, it will be socialism, because they're so influenced by communism and socialism that they will incorporate it all into one, and, you know, they will impose these kind of bans. But as for the Islamic system, it's set, and And that's precisely my point, that the rules, the regulations, and the prohibitions are all set, which is why women are allowed to drive, because there's nothing in the Quran which prohibits them. So, you know, thousands of years later, we can now make the deduction that women are allowed to drive. So, in answer to that, how do you determine, you know, a democracy that is set? You don't. You choose Islam instead, which is set. As for how the ruler is chosen, that is done in a way, unfortunately, which a lot of Muslims now interpret as democracy, because they reduce the entire democratic system to elections, and, you know, the people would choose their ruler, which is quite ironic, because so many people in this room probably didn't choose their ruler in this country right now. So it's done in that way, and when the Prophet, peace be upon him, when he passed away, this was the same system that was adapted. So certain people were put forth, and then the Muslim nation would then give their allegiance to a particular leader. So it is done in a democratic way, if you like, if you want to reduce democracy to the electoral system. And again, this is another way of guaranteeing that someone can't just come out and say, okay, you know, I'm your next leader, kind of thing.
Oh, can I speak from here? I like that.
Yeah, that's fine.
I'm a socialist, so I think that the more of we sort of point between what are the different options in Egypt at the moment, and is it a kind of Western style democracy or an Islamic state? And I'd argue that there's another option, which is, I'll call it that. I don't believe that a Western democracy in Egypt, or even that the West is particularly democratic. In Britain we have 656 MPs. We get to elect them once every 4 years, and in the meantime they can do whatever the hell they want. Most of the people in control who are making the real decisions have the economic levers of power. So we're talking a lot at the moment about the roles of the banks to play in the IMF, the World Bank, etc. And if you look at what's going on in Greece at the moment, as soon as Western liberal democracy no longer fits, in other words, when you can no longer force the Greek population to accept massive cuts to their living standards, a third of most people's paying conditions, they get rid of liberal democracy and impose technocrats, basically, and have imposed government on the Greek people. So, while I don't believe the West is actually democratic, and I wouldn't argue for a liberal Western democracy, because I don't believe that parliamentary democracy is democratic. So what does that mean for Egypt? So far there's been a political revolution in that Mubarak's been overthrown, they've got rid of the kind of political elite, but the vast majority of the Egyptian state is still exactly the same. The network around Mubarak, the people that control the wealth in Egyptian society haven't gone. Most people still live on less than $2 a day, etc., etc. So just having a kind of parliamentary democracy in Egypt, I don't think goes far enough. And in terms of question for women, most women in Egypt, if you're living on less than $2 a day in slums where you've got more likely to be attacked or a victim of violence or whatever, most women in Egypt really want to be able to have bread, a house, a decent standard of living. So for me the question is kind of how do we actually achieve that? So I think there needs to be a deepening of the revolutionary process in Egypt for there to be a social revolution, not just a political revolution, and need to take economic power as well away from the ruling elite. But precisely the reason that you were talking about at the beginning, all that's going to happen if parliamentary democracy is set up in Egypt is it'll be manipulated by Western imperialism. They've already started doing this right across the Arab world at the moment, and they're not doing it in the interest of Arab women. Someone mentioned Iran, so similar arguments can be used about Afghanistan. Sorry, I'm wrong with that. Women in Afghanistan are being oppressed, so let's bomb Afghanistan and try to
socialism has that. The mere fact that the Arabs were able to take Bashar al-Assad, you know, in his Ba'ath, Hizb al-Ba'ath, that they were able to take this liberal concept of socialism and just, you know, turn it into complete tyranny. And the other reason, quite simply, is the fact that what's wrong with Islam? Islam has a political system, it has an economic system, it has a social system. Why do we need to look any further? And I would argue that the simple fact that people they feel the need to look any further than Islam is a result of that colonization. Because Islam was working. You know, for so many years, Islam was implemented as a single state, as in the head was in one state, and then governance is in the rest of the Arab and Muslim world. It was working. It was fine. It had some defects towards the end of the Ottoman Empire, but what assisted those defects and what assisted the destruction? It was none other than Lord Curzon and Lord Cromer. So I don't think there's any need for socialism. Obviously, if there's a system not working now in a country, then yeah, you look for another system. But I don't think that's the case for the Arab world.
Also just point out when we talk about an Islamic State, because I don't know a lot about the version that you're proposing, like, it's important to remember that really not the whole of the Middle East is Muslim at all, and where do those people come under this? I know the media has tried to push that there is more of it, but there has been some sectarian conflict in Egypt, and this, like, if this version were to come about and Egypt were to become an Islamic state, how, like, where would the Copts and Egypt's few remaining Jews be on this negotiating table of how it comes about and how their rights be protected? And so I just think, I know that's not related, I just think it's important to remember that we're not talking about a 100% Muslim region, and that it's like a sensitive issue to remember.
When democracy and secularism was implemented in Muslim lands, majority of the people there were Muslim, and they were practicing Muslims. Now, how is it that secularism was implemented within a people which didn't even agree with it, and they didn't want their religion to be separated? That's one point. And the second is the fact that when the Prophet established the state in Medina, and not a lot of people know this, majority of the people there were Jews. And this is the thing. Sorry.
And this is why I mentioned the fact that the Medinan Charter, as we call it, the Medinan state. So most of the people living there were Jews, and Jews are allowed to have their private courts. They live under the protection of the Islamic State. They live as equal citizens as Muslims do. The only difference is Muslims have more responsibilities. So Muslims have to volunteer in the army, etc. Non-Muslims don't have to. So I think it's maybe the version of Islam that you're imagining, maybe that's the Taliban version of Islam. Maybe that's why you can't see the fact that they can live and they have lived under the Islamic State. In fact, many a times in history, it was the Christians who would write to the Muslim leaders and ask them for help against their own Christian oppressive leaders. So Islam isn't a utopian which can only be implemented upon Muslims. It's an ideology which can be implemented upon a majority non-Muslim. And I think there's just one thing I want to touch on. Maybe the thing that you're thinking of is the Muslim women's dress. That how is it that non-Muslims would, how can this dress code be imposed upon them? And I want to give this example because there are many other things which don't apply to non-Muslims in the Islamic State. And the dress code that I'm adhering to right now does not apply to non-Muslims. And so there are leniencies because I adhere to this dress code as a mode of worship to my Creator. If a non-Muslim doesn't agree with that code now, nor does he follow Islam or she follows Islam, then why would that be implemented upon her, the dress code? So in a sense that, you know, the non-Muslims get all the protection, all of the economic benefits from the Islamic State, but really have to give very little in turn.
I'm not sort of imagining some sort of Taliban-esque regime in Egypt. Also about the fact that maybe I was thinking about women's dress in an Islamic state. We've been talking a lot about this on my course, and actually Jewish and Christian women have worn headscarves during the past 2,000 years, more than that as well. I wasn't considering that an Islamic state would force a Christian woman to wear a hijab, merely that just that would their rights also be respected if it's a regime, if it's a state with a wholly Islamic character. Just wondering how that incorporates people of other religions. But as I said, I don't know sort of the ideology that you'd be proposing, so I have no preconceptions about how this would be in place. It sounds like an ideology like this has never been in place apart from perhaps the time of the Prophet, but that all Muslim sort of states after that have not been, so I'm not sure if we've ever seen anything like this. So
Any more questions? Oh, I see. Do you want to come first? Do you want to come first?
Okay, thank you for both speakers. It's very enlightening what you've been mentioning. I've just got 2 points, one for Amy and one for Farah. Basically, if you look at the relationship between Syria and America, they have a very close relationship in terms of their rendition. So, for example, recently, Maharar was a prisoner who was rendered by the US to Syria to be tortured under Bashar al-Assad. So when you look at the relationship in terms of the both countries, in terms of humanitarian aid, etc., etc., they are very close in terms of torture and, imprisonment and undignifying the nation as per se. But what I want to know from Amy is, as Amnesty International does work amongst these countries, and raises awareness, would it be possible to just show how you would address the issue of torture and rendition amongst these countries, and what would solve them from doing such acts, basically? And for Farah, basically, I was watching a program recently on Panorama about women, Muslim women, and honour killings. And in this program, it was shown that most of these women that are dishonoured and killed out of honour and violence, etc., stems from their religious upbringing. So what does Islam actually have to say about the way the woman is viewed in terms of society or as part of a country? Is it the case that Panorama was showing the viewpoint of oppression, indignity, dishonourment, or is it any other? Okay, thank you.
Okay, so just to clarify your question, that how a post-revolutionary state would address torture and rendition between itself and a country that undoubtedly has more military and economic power than itself. Is that? Yeah. Okay. I'm not sure. I guess it would have to start legislatively. That torture would have to be made. Torture ought to be illegal, and just that, like for example, the extra rendition agreement that the UK has with the US, which means that we can, the US can extradite any citizen it wants from the UK. I just think agreements like that are wholly detrimental, and I'm not sure how you break the power relations that go on between the UK, the US and other states which aren't as economically or militarily as powerful as them, so come to rely on, or perhaps are definitely forced to cooperate with them by these states. Torture and rendition would come with a total break from these countries, and I don't know, gaining enough political autonomy to not have the like reliance on the US or the UK, not reliance but forced cooperation, I think, is how it would be dealt with.
I think it's quite interesting that you brought up honour killings, and more interesting that it came from mainstream TV, because that's where most misconceptions about Islam come from. As for honour killings, it's not from Islam. But what happens when a religion or an ideology is so innate in people and it's not implemented, it's then mixed with other thoughts and other cultures. And that, I think, is exactly the case with honour killings. That there is this sense, like I said in the beginning, that the woman is honour. There is a sense that the woman is honour. And how now you deal with something which you perceive to be dishonouring. Bear in mind, it might not actually be something which is contrary to Islam. It might be that somebody wants to marry someone of another culture, and the parents decide, no, this isn't allowed. Islam allows and encourages that. So in some cases, honour killings can actually be anti-Islamic. That they are carried out for the same, for the same thing which Islam actually allows. But I do think that it is it's more cultural than anything else, especially in the Indian Pakistani culture. These things are quite big.
Last questions? Yeah, come back.
Just a few comments and then I'll ask my question. I think first of all it's important to make note that the Islamic State doesn't exist today. And that's important because that's going to help us contextualize what the people in those countries mean by freedom. Because when they say freedom there, it means the freedom from the oppression that they've been undergoing for the last few decades. Because if you were to ask women in the Muslim world, do they want sexual liberal freedom like they have here in the West, which has objectified women, built porn industries which are worth billions of dollars. If you look at over half the content on the internet is all porn. And its focus is always about objectifying and using the woman as the focal point towards these issues. Now, as a result of this sexualization, what you're finding in the West now is, if you look at something like rape statistics, last year there was up to, I think, just under 16,000 rapes in this country. And there's studies to show that 1 in 4 women have either undergone rape or had attempted rape. Now, that should really make us think and put into perspective, is this what they're calling for in the Muslim world? Because we need to take history into account in all of this. In the West, they've had a long history of the state and church, clergy, the separation of these two things. And this actually happened, or this was actually instigated because people like Adam Smith, who's commented on this, saw what was happening in the Muslim world in terms of progression, and saw that they were backward, and this initiated the revolution and the changes that we see here in the West. And the reason why I'm making the point about contextualizing this, because it's very easy to look at the Islamic model and say, well, why does it not have democracy? Why does it not have women being able to wear whatever they want? The way it has to be looked at is objectively to say, look, what has the capability of solving problems? And that's what we need to look at. If it solves the problem of rape, and we're not being able to solve the problem of rape in this country, then obviously that needs to be discussed. But my question is that, look, history has a big part to play in the beliefs and the needs of the people there. The West has a long history of this clash between the state and the clergy, whereas in the Muslim world, you didn't have that history. Yeah, they've always lived under an Islamic state up to 1924, and now they don't. What I'd ask, like the speakers did mention, is that how much of a consideration should that be taken into when we look at moving forward in those parts of the country, or the world, sorry.
This is precisely why I mentioned colonization in the beginning, because the colonial thinking is the fact that our history has taught us greater lessons and that they are universal lessons. And that's why it's failed in the Muslim world, because it didn't take into consideration the Muslim history. And I'm glad that you mentioned the point that there was no clash. That clergy and the state, or what, I'm sure you're referring to the clergy as Islam and the state, politics, there was no clash. That they went side by side because the system was based on the religion. So where would the clash be? And that the system was fair. The system didn't tax people heavily like it did in the Western model, as a result of which secularism came about. So I think you made a perfect comment that it's not applicable, and that's the point.
Thank you both. Are you willing to accept if the majority of people, say in Syria, chose a religious state? Are the West and the countries in the West, or the humanitarian people, human rights advocates, willing to accept this state? And are you willing to accept that the majority of the people in Syria or in one of those countries, by the way, I'm Syrian, chose to go with the West type of democracy, choose the human rights? And by the way, we should stop defending Islam about very close to human rights, because they are quite different. There will always be differences. Like you mentioned, inheritance, it's not the same. It's not equal between women and men. Women doesn't equal. It's not the same in Islam. So it's different, really. But my point of view is that what happened, the uprising, happened just for one cause, not to remove secular or to bring Islam or anything else. It's for people to have the right to choose. Let us give them the right to choose, because what happened in the past, as Farah mentioned, people came to the power using ideology like socialism, but they came to the power by gun, and they stayed there and prevented people from thinking. And I really wish that kind of debate, this debate, actually shouldn't be for Western people or people in the West, should happen in those countries, informing people about both ideologies or any kind of ideology, and let the people choose. And more importantly, I think, than choosing, because they might choose wrong in the beginning, that every few years there should be more opportunity to choose and change. If this government of this type of ideology didn't improve their life, then they should be able to change it and choose another ideology. But the problem in the countries, once one of this ideology spread and stayed, it will take the power and stay in the power, stopping people from thinking or trying to improve or something like that. So my opinion is this debate should happen there. Let the people choose. And there will always be one law in the society. You can't just have multiple laws. There will be one law, either it's the Islamic law or the other law, according to the people's wishes. And there will always be, like in the West, people who don't agree with the current government or the current ideology. Those people, if they are, the majority chose that the current government should, still abide by law until they have the more opportunity to talk about themselves, to try to change it by democracy, by talking, by people changing their minds, finding better improvement, better ideology. The problem at the moment is that people reach and stay by gun. So we should be willing to accept the change. So you should be willing. If the majority are still not convinced with Islam as Islamic law, then you should. It's probably the problem of Muslim people who are not explaining Islam right. And if people choose Islam as Islamic law, then the West should accept that, should stop actually intervening, and let the people see the consequences. If they're happy with the consequences, then that's their choice. That's all I have to say.
Thank you for your question. I think I entirely agree with most of what you said. If the majority of, say, Syria chose an Islamic state, such as Farah proposes, I would really hope that it upheld some basic human rights. I would hope that minorities and gay people were protected under that state, but beyond that, if that's what people want to do, then so be it. I wish that the West, like the UK and the US, like we saw in the aftermath of Gaddafi's death, as soon as that happened, David Cameron and Sarkozy and members of Russia as well, I think, all fled into Libya to crowd round to see how they could carve up parts of the country so that their economic and military interests would be protected in North Africa. I think that's shameful, and if countries wanted to choose, if the majority wanted to choose a state that they felt would represent them, whether it be radically different from anything they'd had before, and whether the international community agreed with it or not, then I'd be in full support of whatever they chose to do. If it was a majority and that's what the people wished, then it's full support to that. I just hope that some of the basic rights enshrined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which that country would not have to sign up to, I'd hope that some of them would be adhered to.
I have a different view. I don't think that in the world that we live in, that we have the liberty of choosing systems which we know are ultimately going to fail. You're Syrian. The Islamic State was once in the heart of your city, Damascus. Did it fail, or was it made to fail?
Okay, if well, it succeeded. It was a successful state, but eventually, when they stayed a long time, it slowly turns to tyranny. People stopped having the right to say or to talk about what they need, what they want, achieve their goals, because we need to understand there is nothing static in life. We are evolving, and stuff has to evolve, and ideas and laws has to evolve. If there is backwards settlers or religious people controlling one government, then they will never be better. And I will fight religious state the same way as I fight secular state to topple it down if it stops people from expressing their ideas and their rights. And so yes, the Islamic State was successful in Syria, but I want to guarantee that the Islamic State, once it's in power, it will not stay in power and stop people from thinking and trying to choose themselves. Because if Islam was imposed, then I don't want that Islam. If Islam came from the people, and people are convinced with Islam, then it will be successful as it was back in the past. So we're talking about the future now. If the people decided that they want Islam, then it's their decision and they should bear the consequences, and they need to be, all the laws should be explained to them before they vote and agree to have such a government and such a state. But if not, we can't just come and impose an ideology. If we impose it, it will be the same tyranny as it is now for all the secular or fake secular states that we've got. That's my idea, my opinion.
There's a story of a Khalif who was oppressive to the religious scholars. His name was Mu'tasim, and the Arabs know this story really well because it's embedded in their history. He was oppressive to a religious scholar, which he later repented for. But at that time, there was a woman in Baghdad who was violated, and she cried out his name, and his name reached him through people. And he sent an entire army. She cried out, "Wa Mu'tasima," and he sent an entire army. So I think as women now, that we have to look at that yes, a leader, and I'm not going to sit here and argue that Islamic State is utopian, because utopians don't exist. There's no...
I know the story, but
Yeah.
we should stop clinging to the past, because he's a hero as what he did, yes. But why, for example, if somebody in the West, if a British woman was upheld in other country, then I'm sure the West, as a democratic, non-religious Islamic state, will go and send their troops or
They
special
do, and
units
they
and
will.
save the woman, and they will.
Well, the Muslims, though,
But while now, our Muslim state,
They won't.
they won't. But that doesn't mean it's not because the Islam is ideology, then we will save the woman, or because the West will save the woman. It's about the national pride. It's about this country is actually with harmony with itself. People like each other, support each other, so want to help each other. So I'm saying, if this caliph did that as a hero, we shouldn't take him as what he did, and we say, okay, we'll impose Islam because it's the better, either you agree with it or not. I don't think that's the solution. I think it should come from the people. People should be convinced that's the solution. It's not he saved the woman because he was, he's Muslim and then he's the best and that's it. I'm sure there will be atheists who will go and
The
save
reason
save
why I
women.
gave you the example of him oppressing a scholar is precisely to show that he wasn't a hero, that he wasn't a perfect Muslim, but that there were regulations in place now for him to not have any choice in, sitting idle and not liberating.
Obviously,
And that's the point. Regulations are in place in the Islamic system.
I'd like to continue this debate, but we're running out of time. And I'd just like to take one more last question from the audience.
Just to bring the point back to women in the Arab uprising, we've seen a lot of women now taking to the streets and uprising against their rulers. Do you feel that democracy secures a political voice for women? I mean, especially reflecting on the fact that in this country, less than a quarter of women in are in parliament, and yet they represent more than 50% of the population. Do you feel that that political voice will be secured for them, since that is the reason why they're going out to the streets in the first place?
I think an answer to that. I'm not sure there is a concrete answer. You're right that I really don't think that women are free under a Western secular liberal model. I don't think women are not oppressed in the UK or any other state that goes by Western secular ideals, which is why there's so much oppression here also, and not as many people there are so few women in Parliament. Do I think that democracy? I just don't think there's an answer to that. I think the answer to that, because it's a gendered question, because it comes down to how can women have a voice, whereas they had a lack of one perhaps before, comes down to what mode of governance those women would want if they could achieve a voice and negotiating tables on how to formulate this new state. And also that because it's a gendered question, it comes down to, I think, fighting against patriarchy within that country, that it almost is secondary to but supersedes the battle between Western secularism and socialism and communism and an Islamic state, and comes down to the patriarchy that persists within all countries on earth, I think. And I think it'd be up to those women to try and find a voice within the patriarchy that they live in, and to fight against that, but to also try and formulate a state, but make sure that hopefully the powers that be the women can come to a table and also put forward their voices, which they have not been afforded the chance to do in Egypt, which is an ominous start to post-revolutionary Egypt, I think.
I think, even there's a lot of propaganda about Islam oppressing women as well. But if you contrast that propaganda with the actual oppression of women which is taking place now, it is things like a woman has to wear the hijab, etc. A woman doesn't get as much inheritance as a man does, which I would have loved to go into. So it's a different type of oppression that people affiliate with Islam. But when you look at society, a society oppresses women when it takes away their right to worship a creator openly and privately. A society takes away a woman's right when it doesn't have clear guidelines in place, and any vague systems that are in place now are at liberty, men are at liberty of choosing or interpreting, etc. So I think democracy does oppress women, and I would argue that Islam came as a liberator to women. Islam came in a society where women little girls were buried alive. Islam came in a society where men had over 200, 300 wives. Islam came in a society where women were not even seen as humans, that they were seen as objects, which is precisely the case under capitalism today. So when you look at where Islam took a woman from and what it turned her into, that you have great women in our history who have helped build universities and education institutions, The famous Imam Shafi'i, his teacher was a female. So I think that you really have to look at where the systems have, which system has gotten you where. And I don't think anybody who examines Islamic history will argue that the Muslim women, their rights were taken away, etc. On the contrary, when the Islamic State was destroyed and these pseudo-Islamic nations came about, it is they who are oppressing the women today because they don't take their legislation from the Quran and Sunnah.
Unfortunately, that's all we've got time for today. I'd like to thank you all for coming, along with the speakers. If you want to know more information about the Asian Women's Society, please, there's a sign-in sheet being passed around. Please write your name and your contact information on, and we'll keep you updated with details of when you can meet us and stuff. Just before you go, I'd like to just show you the trailer again, or try to show you the trailer again. Just to reiterate the point, the importance of this topic, that women are being affected, and important to discuss this topic with